My guest is an immigration researcher and scholar who found herself called to begin conversations outside of academia. Dr. Filiz Garip is a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University and author of On the Move, Changing Mechanisms of U.S. Mexico Migration. Welcome, Dr. Garip. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Anne.
So you are an immigrant yourself.
I am.
More than one time over. And you began your professional work, however, in the field of engineering. What was it that drew you to sociology and more specifically to issues of migration?
It started actually as a random walk because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. And I came here to study engineering in graduate school. And I discovered that it wasn't really a fulfilling calling for me. So I had only studied it to have a professional career. But coming to the United States for higher education, I realized that there's so many more questions that I can ask. And I took social science classes, and immigration really fascinated me from day one, not just because I'm an immigrant, but I think it's a basic fact of life. It's how humans adapt to changing realities. And I think it also shows us the world that we're living in, the way people are reacting to these changes, be it political, environmental, and economic. So I think it's an infinitely fascinating topic. And so that's how I come to study it.
Yeah. And so you're at Princeton now, but you also got your master's at Princeton. And then after that, you were at Harvard for nearly a decade. You were
Yeah.
at Cornell for 5 years, and now you're back at Princeton. Can you just sort of give us an overall sense, without making you kind of go back into history too deeply, how has our understanding of migratory patterns for people changed over
Yes.
the centuries in terms of how we accept it, how we regard it, the value that we ascribe to it?
Absolutely. So migration has always existed, right? So humans have always migrated to adapt to changing situations. But I mostly focus on the history of migration to the United States. And until recently, the biggest group coming to the United States were people from Mexico. So I study Mexico-U.S. migration primarily because it's the longest and most well-documented migration flow in the world, and it gives us a lens to understand migration more broadly. And it also is a setting that has been studied very heavily. There is maybe the biggest data source on migration ever assembled in the world on Mexico-U.S. migration. So I use this kind of data that tracks hundreds of thousands of people over time, over the last 50 years. And what we find when we look at this data, Anne, is really surprising because we tend to think about migrants as a monolithic group, and they're all here to do better. But that actually hides the variation that we see when we look at the data. And we see that migration is not a single story. Even when we look at a single country like Mexico, the reasons people are coming here for are changing all the time. Who's coming here is changing all the time. So I think that's maybe one big lesson that we can take away from this. Migration is always going to be dynamic. It's always going to evolve with the world around it. So any policy that we think about now will likely be irrelevant in the future, will likely not work for everyone in the ways that we expect it to. So it's a much more complex phenomenon, but the way we understand and describe it is very simplistic. So that's where the misalignment is.
In addition to examining data, you also have done thousands of or hundreds at least interviews with
Absolutely.
people who've been a part of a migratory pattern. What are some of the stories that we hear or tell ourselves about who migrants are, particularly Mexican migrants? And what have you found in terms of how that differs from the reality?
Absolutely. So I like hearing personal stories because I'm a migrant myself, and I know my lived experience is very much shaped by who I am and my family. But I also recognize all my decisions happen in a larger context in the world where certain opportunities are available to me. So by talking to people, but also by looking at large-scale data, I try to bring these things together. How do personal stories connect to larger patterns? So when we combine these things, here's kind of some of the surprising things I found in Mexico. So, and much of our current assumptions about Mexicans are actually rooted in maybe like 40 years ago, what migration looked like 40 years ago. And at that time, in the 1970s, most migrants coming from Mexico were men. And they came here for seasonal agricultural labor. Then they went back and worked their own land. And when they were here, they were picking oranges in California. They were harvesting lettuce in Arizona, and maybe kind of working the cornfields in the Midwest. But migration at the time acted almost like a commute. They would come here, work for a few months, save money, go back. This circularity actually broke down. This rhythm of going back and forth broke down, not just because things changed in Mexico, but the way we approached migration in the United States changed. Beginning in the 1980s, we started to ramp up our border enforcement operations. And the idea was that we were going to regulate migration and we would make it harder for people to cross the border so we would have less of an unauthorized migrant population. So the way it worked out was, for some people, that meant the end of the journey because they couldn't circulate anymore and they decided to stay back. But for many people, it meant a different decision. They would come here and just stay longer because it would be harder to go back and forth. They just made their duration here longer to make it worth their time. So we did two things with this policy. We discouraged people from coming, but we also discouraged people from leaving. So in the 1980s, other things were happening in Mexico. So the middle-class families that were stable until then suddenly found themselves struggling economically because the peso lost its value and prices soared at the same time, jobs disappeared overnight. So even middle-class families started thinking about migration as a strategy to cope with this economic situation. And at that time, the migrant profile also changed. So it was no longer younger adults, but basically children, teenage boys who were coming through our border. And for them, it didn't matter how hard it was to cross. They would try as many times as it took because they were there to help their families. So the logic of migration also changed at the time. So these are the kinds of shifts, and I have more examples, but these are the kinds of shifts that we're seeing with each time period. The group that's coming here is slightly different, but we're not really adapting to the changes in the driving forces behind migration. We're only thinking in terms of the border, which is only a tiny part of a more complex picture.
So when you began your research, you were working in and really focused on communicating with other people within the academic world, fellow researchers, your
Absolutely.
academic peers. And a lot of those conversations that happen in a scholarly environment are of a different kind. They have different goals and they're very insular in some ways. I mean, they're spreading knowledge among that community, but not necessarily communicating the findings to the outside world directly. So you made a decision at some point that you wanted to sort of breach that barrier or that, from one world into another and decided that you wanted to enter the world of people who are communicating directly with sort of the general public, whether you're writing op-eds or writing a book.
Right.
Why did you come to that decision?
I was actually very comfortable, happy in my academic world. And I work with data, and I always thought the data should speak for itself. But I realized that that's not actually how it works. And people's understanding of migration is based on, things that are, coming from the past. They're not relevant anymore. And I also noticed this in my own family. So I'm from Turkey originally, and Turkey became a migrant receiving country after the Syrian crisis. And right now there's over 5 million migrants in Turkey. So I saw almost this change overnight in how people talked about migration and how much, information was based on basically anecdotes or perceptions or people's things that people saw on social media. So I then realized, okay, I can't just stand by while all of this is happening. And as uncomfortable as it feels, especially at first, to become a kind of more of a public speaker, I thought it was kind of part of the job, that if I'm studying this important topic that people are talking about, and actually, for a lot of countries, immigration serves multiple purposes, but we're not really having these conversations. So that was a turning point. Also, until maybe 2015, 2016, immigration was not high up in our national conversation in the United States. And suddenly it became the topic. And that actually pulled me more into talking about these issues in in the public.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about migratory trends and patterns, and also the conversations that we should be having around migration. We're talking to Dr. Filiz Garip. If you'd like to join our conversation, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. Dr. Garip, in terms of that conversation changing, I mean, I think a lot of people attribute that to our current president, who
Mhm.
really embraced the issue of migration and immigration as a platform to run on and to build support around. You, I believe, at that time, we're finding that the conversations that we're having about migration in the United States are very rarely rooted in data, and that the conversations that we're having are very often about sort of
Yeah.
misaligned with what's actually happening. Can you give some examples of what the sort of national conversation was then or has become, and how it differs from what you have found?
Um, yeah, that's a great question. So, to be fair, I think we should have been having the immigration conversation maybe all along. So, if we look at the US, the last comprehensive immigration reform in this country happened in 1986, 40 years ago. So, in a way, all our laws are based in an era, in a world that no longer exists from 40 years ago. So, all the measures that we had in the 1986 reform came up in a time where migration was very different. It was mostly men coming for seasonal work and mainly from Mexico. So now all of these patterns are very different now. And we have migrants doing all kinds of jobs in the United States, working in construction and healthcare. And these are not seasonal jobs, these are year round jobs. So we need a more stable workforce. And our migrants are not just coming from Mexico, but from Central America and other regions of the world. So I think we needed to adapt anyway. We needed to kind of have this conversation about what our goals are as a country, what are the economic needs, what are the values that we stand by. And that wasn't happening. And I think the Trump administration, or running for election, Trump actually saw this opening, and you know that gave them an opportunity to frame the conversation in the way that they wanted to have. And then suddenly people realized, yes, immigration is an issue and we should be having a conversation about this. But then the information that we're hearing, it's all about the border, it's all about unauthorized migration. These are basically painting a tiny part of the complex picture that we're seeing. So I think we should be just standing back and looking at it much more holistically than just the border. Immigration is not just about the border, it's about the kind of future we're imagining for this country, the kind of needs that we have, not just now, but in the next 30, 40 years.
You talk about the issue of migration, and that is different than the language which is often presented as the problem of migration. Is migration a problem? When does it become a problem? When does it become something that a nation, whether it's the United States or anywhere else, believes it needs to build policies that are deflective and keep people away?
I mean, migration can be seen as a problem. It can also be seen as a solution. It just depends on what our goals are as a country, right? So, one of the things that I keep thinking about is what the demographic future of the world is going to look like in the next 30, 40 years. So, a lot of countries are aging and they're having fewer children. So that means that the working population in many countries is really shrinking. There are not enough people to fill the jobs. So the United States has really not faced this issue until now because we've always welcomed younger workers. But if immigration slows down, that means that that's no longer going to be the case. We're going to face the same issues that countries in countries like Italy, Spain, or Japan are facing. So in some regions of Italy, factories have to cut back production because they don't have enough workers. In Japan, small businesses are struggling, even when demand is strong, because there's simply no one to work. So we've basically avoided this fate. We've remained a dynamic, vibrant economy, in part because we've constantly replenished our workforce. So if we don't see this bigger picture, it's easy to look at the numbers now and think about, okay, so many people cross the border without kind of us detecting them. So there's this big unauthorized population, and that's a problem. And I understand where people are coming from when they see that. But we're missing this bigger picture of people come where jobs are. So people are coming because there's labor demand here. And that's how our economy has remained very strong compared to other advanced economies. So I think it, again, depends on what we're focusing on. If we're only focusing on the border and how many people are coming in and we want to reduce these numbers, that's one thing. But we're not really seeing what brings people here. And that's what my work is about. What is it actually that brings people here? Why do people migrate? And it's not, again, one story. So we need to see this full picture to understand how migration works and to manage it better.
It's interesting. Earlier, you were talking about, how quote unquote secure border, like a more um, prohibitive border,
Yeah.
a border wall, changed migration in ways that perhaps were not anticipated in terms of rather than, allowing for a cyclical migration, it actually perhaps brought more permanent migrants into the country and prevented them from leaving in a way,
Yeah.
reinforcing the quote problem
Right.
that it was trying to resolve.
Exactly. And it comes back to our trying to fit all migrants into one box. So we're not seeing the variation in the reasons that bring people here. And at the time, before our border measures, people's goals from Mexico were not necessarily to settle in the United States. It made more sense for them to earn their money here and spend it back home. The money went a long way if you spent it in Mexico. But then when you kind of make the border more secure, then that changes that calculation, right? Again, it didn't work in the ways that we hoped it would. It also didn't work the same way for different groups of people. For some people, it created the desired effect of pushing them out, but for other people, it created the opposite impetus to stay longer, and for others, it was relevant because they would come no matter what, escaping the crisis situation back home. So I think this is the complexity we need to embrace when we're talking about immigration policy.
I mean, I would guess if people are moving and because of a wall, unable to kind of come and go as they previously did, and they're living here on a more permanent basis, that would also create an incentive or an inclination to bring family members along that they're not able to go back and visit, perhaps, wives and
Absolutely.
children.
Absolutely. It changes the entire logic of migration, and it also changes migrants' trajectory. So imagine you come here and your goal is to work for a few years, raise enough money, go back, buy land, and then, have your family there. The living standards are going to be much higher than if you bring your entire family here. Now you have to pay for rent, you have to pay for cost of living here, and then the entire logic of migration has really shifted. So this is why we need to understand what's driving people to come to the United States.
We're talking to Dr. Filiz Garip about immigration and immigration patterns. We have a question from Ed on Facebook. He says most people, or a comment, I guess, most people are fine with legal vetted immigrants and immigrants with work visas. It is the illegal undocumented that is the problem. This is not just the way the American people see it, but the rest of the world who also has problems with undocumented immigrants.
That's right. This is not undocumented migration is not just an issue in the United States. Most European countries have a certain share of undocumented immigrants, maybe 1 in 10 in Southern Europe, for example. So that's right. I think I agree that we need a more regulated system. The misalignment comes from the fact that even when people come in without documents, they're able to work here. It means that they're meeting a demand that we're really not acknowledging.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we wanted to regulate this system better, maybe increasing temporary visas available to people would really help. And that would actually solve the issue of not wanting to go back because you don't know if you want to come back, you can come back in. So if people know that they can get this temporary visa year in and year out, that also eases the decision-making process. And it's easier for people to come here, work, collect the money and go back home. So I think we just need to make these two things align, the economic realities and then, the limited nature of our visa programs.
Here in Florida, we've been hearing that there are going to be some dire impacts about, a crackdown on immigration, whether it's the agricultural world or, home construction or, care facilities of one kind or another. Do we know yet whether that is happening? What the impacts we're seeing, are so far?
So I'm really not an expert on immigration enforcement actions, and I maybe like most of us, I kind of find it quite confusing to follow the news day in and day out. A lot of things are happening at the same time. But what I do find is that migration always responds to change, be it economic, policy, or political. So, and migrants are here because of the labor demand, mainly because they find these jobs. And in Florida, actually, is maybe gives us a preview of what's going to happen in the rest of the country because Florida has very high shares of immigrants. So I think 22% of Floridians are foreign born. So this is more than the national average of 14%. Miami is maybe the highest share of foreign born in the country. Jacksonville, the numbers are smaller, but it's still 1 in 10 residents is an immigrant. And they kind of, Florida is also older than the rest of the country. There's a lot of retirees here, and immigrants actually fill this critical gap in the workforce. So they cover, construction, they cover agriculture, they cover the health sector, they cover care needs of the retirees in their homes. So if immigration is restricted, and it has also low unemployment rate, it means that there is not enough native workers to cover these jobs. So basically, Florida is going to feel the pinch of this more than other places. But I think if we continue in this kind of more restrictive path, it's going to be a preview of what's going to happen in the rest of the country because we're so dependent on immigrant labor in many sectors, and there simply aren't enough native-born workers to work on the specific jobs in which we have a need.
We talked about writing for academia versus, writing for the general public. Can you explain, though, how the conversation that's happening, sort of in the general news media or the general world of policy can impact how academics are doing their research in terms of what the priorities are, what kind of funding mechanisms there are for certain kinds of research? I mean, what is the dynamic as it plays back into the world of research?
I think ideally there should be a very fruitful relationship between the two worlds, right? Because journalists are keeping the pulse of what's happening. Whereas as academics, we're kind of trying to look at the bigger picture, the historical picture, and trying to see this moment in terms of like that wider perspective. But I think lately the conversation has been so short term and so razor focused on just the border. But migration is not just about the border. Our enforcement actions do certain things, but they do not remove the underlying causes of migration. So I think I would just like to open up this conversation and help us see where we are from this bigger historical perspective and just help us see that the conversations we're having is actually really a tiny portion of the picture. So our world, I mean, academia is also impacted by what's happening. So I mentioned that one of the things I try to do is focus on the facts, right? Focus on the evidence, not make assumptions, and for that I need data. And the data set that I'm using, for example, is maybe the largest migration data ever assembled in the world by Mexican Migration Project. So this project has followed thousands, hundreds of thousands of people over the last 50 years. And the data has been supported mostly by public funding from National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. And the group had just received another 5 years of funding to continue the research and extend the research to Central American countries, which are the main senders of migrants to the United States today. But those efforts are now being threatened by funding cuts. And I do worry about our ability to assess the situation if we don't have these data sources going forward.
In terms of, speaking as a scholar, very often people in that world are somewhat reluctant to engage on, in these kind of more political arenas, in part because the complexity of these issues is perhaps greater than, a lot of mediums allow for in
Yeah.
terms of, the conversation that should be happening, the layers and the complexity. How do you communicate with the general public differently than perhaps you communicate in the world of academia?
I actually find that exercise really helpful for myself because sometimes in academia, we also get blindsided or we also get too focused on the details and we miss the bigger picture. I think it's a very healthy exercise to pull out from your world and try to see what's relevant for people to know. Maybe they shouldn't know everything about my research, but one thing that I find is important to say is that there's so much variation in migration that we're not acknowledging. Different people are coming for different reasons, and these groups are changing all the time. So migration is really dynamic. So whatever we think today will not be relevant in the future, and we need a system to do that. So I think I try to find these messages that are grounded in data. And all of this is not my opinion, it's based on the data. It's based on what the data tell us. And when my principle is that my task is to bring data to these conversations, I think it's an easier transition for me because I don't think in partisan ways. I don't think about ideology. As a scientist, as a person, that might be a different thing. But as a scientist, my goal is to basically tell everyone what we know from data. And I think that makes it easier for me, maybe not to be pulled into the complexity of the issues or how people might feel about them.
I've got some comments that I'd like to get to. Linnell on Facebook saying, we end up with a system where people with money get access and get visas, and those fleeing cartels, climate collapse, and other issues are shut out. We certainly should touch on the issue of climate as it pertains to migration, because that is obviously a discussion that has been ongoing, but is really only getting more impacted, I guess.
Absolutely. So that's a great point. I think just as a side comment, we tend to favor high-skilled migrants whose access to visas is easier. But like I said, a lot of the jobs in which we need more people are not these high-skilled jobs, are not only these high-skilled jobs. We also have needs in the low-skill sector, which are very hard to fill with, the native-born population. So I think that's a great point that our listener made. In terms of climate, I think there are many factors that affect migration, and climate is becoming a big one. In my own research, we've looked at how droughts in the past have impacted migration out of Mexico. And what I find is really interesting and surprising to some degree. So these droughts or extreme weather situations do not really increase migration to a great extent. So there's not a lot more departures. The impact is small, in part because migration is already happening. But once migrants are here, if these extreme events continue back in their communities, they are less likely to return. So they're delaying their return if these things are happening. This means that these climate events might be trapping people in other places, and that has implications for our policy. So I'm really grateful for our listener to bring up this point.
John on Facebook writes, the professor noted we need to increase the number of visas based on the demand for jobs, which doesn't take into account the fact that employers will always have a need for lower paid workers with less and less worker protections.
Well, that's right. That's right. I mean, there are different ways of trying to prevent undocumented migration. One way would be to secure the border. The other way would be increase sanctions on employers. And we have a system called E-Verify that requires employers to verify the status of their workers, but this system does not work in a flawless way. So I think we need to find ways of squaring these two things, maybe kind of increasing visas, but also encouraging employers to use the regular paths, not the irregular ones.
And then just briefly, I do want to get to one more comment because we're going to have to wrap. But Ricardo said, commenting on what Ed said, he said, people are okay with legal immigration, but not illegal. Ricardo says, the fact is, if they're getting hired and working, it means people who employ them are okay with the status quo. The rhetoric is different than the reality.
I think that's right. The economic realities do not always align with the way we talk about. And then I think when we talk about undocumented immigrants, we make it about them. We make it about the fact that these people cross the border illegally. They're here because, they have opportunities here and all that. But it's also, we're not thinking about us and how our needs are driving the people here. So I think we need to bring these two things together more.
Well, it is a fascinating topic. Dr. Garip will be speaking today at the River Club at noon. It is the Global Business Luncheon. It is brought by the World Affairs Council. Dr. Filiz Garip, thank you so much for coming on today. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you for having me. I loved having this conversation.